He stood in the rubble with 7 German rifles pointed at his chest. They barked orders in sharp, clipped German. He should have raised his hands. He should have dropped his rifle. Instead, he laughed, a low, cold sound that made the enemy hesitate for just 2 seconds. That hesitation cost him everything. November 1944. The forest of eastern France had turned into a meat grinder. The American 3rd Infantry Division was pushing toward the German border through terrain that swallowed men whole, dense woods, muddy logging roads, and villages reduced to skeletal remains. Every mile was paid for in blood. Every farmhouse could hide a machine gun nest. Every tree could erupt with fire. Private First Class James R. Hendrix was 23 years old, a farm boy from Arkansas who'd grown up hunting deer and shooting cans off fence posts. He had joined the Army in early 1943, trained at Camp Howes in Texas, and shipped out to North Africa before the invasion of Sicily. By the time he reached France in August of 1944, he had already seen more death than most men see in 10 lifetimes. But nothing had prepared him for what the German resistance would become as the Allies pushed closer to the fatherland itself. The closer they got to Germany, the harder the enemy fought. Surrender was no longer an option for many Wehrmacht soldiers. Behind them lay their homes, their families, and the threat of Soviet vengeance from the east. In front of them stood exhausted American and British forces who had been fighting since Normandy. It was a collision of desperation and duty. Hendrix's platoon had been reduced from 42 men to 19 in just 3 weeks. They moved through villages with names they couldn't pronounce, clearing houses one at a time, checking every shadow, every doorway, every cellar. The weight of constant vigilance carved lines into young faces. Sleep came in 20-minute intervals. Food was cold rations eaten while crouching behind walls. The smell of cordite, wet wool, and decay became normal. On the morning of November 16th, Hendrix's company received orders to secure a small crossroads hamlet called Aubeville. Barely a village, just 8 buildings clustered around the intersection of 2 muddy roads. Intelligence reported light resistance. Maybe a squad of rear guard troops. Maybe nothing. The briefing officer spoke with the tired confidence of a man who had given the same speech 100 times. Secure the crossroads. Hold it. Wait for armor support. They moved out at dawn, a column of tired men with rifles slung low, boots sucking at the mud with every step. The forest around them was silent, except for the occasional drip of water from bare branches. No birds, no wind, just the sound of their own breathing and the metallic clink of equipment. Aubeville appeared through the mist like a ghost. Roofs caved in, walls pocked with shrapnel, a church steeple leaning at a drunken angle. Hendrix's squad took the left flank, moving in a staggered line toward the largest building, a 2-story stone farmhouse with wooden shutters hanging loose on broken hinges. They reached the farmhouse without contact. That should have been the first warning. Silence in war is never a good sign. It means someone is watching, waiting, choosing their moment. Hendrix's squad leader, Sergeant Morrow, signaled for 2 men to check the front entrance. Hendrix and another private, a kid from Ohio named Kowalski, moved around the side to cover the back. Standard procedure. Clear the building, secure the position, call it in. The back of the farmhouse opened onto a small courtyard enclosed by a low stone wall. Firewood was stacked against the wall. A rustic cart sat on its side, one wheel missing. Hendrix stepped into the courtyard with his M1 Garand raised, scanning windows, doorways, shadows. That's when the door exploded open. 7 German soldiers poured out in a rush, 2 fast for a planned ambush, 2 panicked for a counterattack. They had been hiding in the cellar and heard the Americans moving through the building above them. They ran straight into the courtyard, intending to break through the back and escape into the woods. Instead, they ran straight into Hendrix and Kowalski. For a single frozen moment, both sides stared at each other across 20 feet of muddy courtyard. Hendrix saw their faces, young, older, scared, angry. He saw the coal scuttle helmets, the Feldgrau wool uniforms, the Kar 98K rifles swinging toward him. He heard Kowalski sucking a breath beside him. Then everyone started shouting at once. The Germans screamed commands in harsh German. Hand hoch, Waff runter. Hands up, drop your weapon. 3 of them had rifles leveled directly at Hendrix's chest. Another had his aimed at Kowalski. The rest were fanning out, try and create a perimeter, clearly expecting the Americans to surrender. Kowalski started to raise his hands. His rifle dipped toward the ground. Hendrix could feel the weight of 7 enemy weapons trained on them, could see the fingers on triggers, could calculate the math of this moment. If they surrendered, they'd be prisoners. If they were lucky, if the Germans were in a hurry or feeling cruel, they'd be shot in the courtyard and left in the mud. But something else rose up in James Hendrix in that moment. Something that had been building for months of fear and exhaustion and watching friends die. Something that came from deep in the Arkansas woods where he'd learned to hunt, learned to shoot, learned that hesitation gets you killed. He laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or a scared laugh. It was low and cold and utterly without fear. It was the sound of a man who had already decided what was going to happen next. The Germans hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for their eyes to flicker with confusion. Why was this American laughing? Why wasn't he dropping his weapon? That 1 second hesitation was all Hendrix needed. His M1 Garand was already at his shoulder. His finger was already on the trigger. And James Hendrix, farm boy from Arkansas who'd spent his childhood shooting moving targets in thick brush, did what he'd been trained to do. He fired. The M1 Garand is a semi-automatic rifle, 8 rounds in the clip. Each pull of the trigger sends a .30 caliber round downrange at 2,800 feet per second. In trained hands, it can fire all 8 rounds in under 5 seconds. Hendrix's first shot hit the German directly in front of him, center mass. The man went down before his brain registered what had happened. Hendrix shifted his aim 2 degrees left and fired again. Another German dropped. He shifted right, fired, shifted, fired. The courtyard erupted into chaos. The Germans tried to return fire, but they were caught flat-footed. Their rifles were bolt action. Each shot required a manual reload. Hendrix's semi-automatic gave him a catastrophic advantage in close quarters. By the time the first German squeezed his trigger, 3 of his comrades were already down. Kowalski snapped out his shock and opened fire as well, his own M1 barking in rapid succession. But it was Hendrix who dominated that courtyard. He moved with mechanical precision, each shot deliberate, each shift of aim calculated. No wasted movement, no panic, just cold, efficient violence. A German soldier managed to get off a shot that zipped past Hendrix's ear with a sound like tearing fabric. Hendrix put 2 rounds into him and kept moving. Another tried to run for the wall. Hendrix shot him in the back before he made 3 steps. His first clip pinged out, the distinctive metallic sound of an empty M1. He had a fresh clip in his hand before the empty one hit the ground, slamming it home with practiced speed. 8 more rounds. The remaining Germans tried to scatter. One made it to the woodpile and crouched behind it, trying to bring his rifle to bear. Hendrix shot through the stack logs. The .30 caliber rounds punched through the dry wood like it was paper. The German slumped forward. Another tried to return fire from behind the overturned cart. Kowalski kept him pinned while Hendrix flanked left, circling the courtyard with his rifle never leaving his shoulder. He came around the cart at an angle and put 3 rounds into the German before the man even saw him coming. 35 seconds after it started, the courtyard was silent again. 7 Germans lay dead or dying in the mud. 19 of them in total will be found in and around that farmhouse once the smoke cleared. The 7 in the courtyard plus 12 more who had been hiding in other parts of the building and were killed in the larger firefight that followed. But those first 7, the ones who had Hendrix at gunpoint, died in that brutal 35-second window. Hendrix stood in the center of the courtyard, his rifle still raised, his breathing steady. His hands weren't shaking. His eyes were clear. Kowalski stood beside him, staring at the carnage, his face pale. "Jesus Christ," Kowalski whispered. "Jesus Christ, Hendrix." Hendrix didn't respond. He was already scanning for more threats, already checking windows and doorways, already moving to the next moment. There was no time to process what had just happened. Processing got you killed. Sergeant Morrow and the rest of the squad came rushing around the corner, weapons raised, expecting to find their men dead or captured. Instead, they found Hendrix calmly reloading and 7 enemy soldiers sprawled in the mud. Morrow took in the scene with the quick assessment of a veteran. He looked at Hendrix, then at the bodies, then back at Hendrix. "You good?" Morrow asked. "I'm good," Hendrix said. That was all that was said. There were no congratulations, no speeches, no slaps on the back. Just a nod from Morrow, and an order to secure the building and call it in. The war continued. It always continued. But word spread fast through the company, then the battalion, then the regiment. The story of the private who laughed at 7 Germans pointing rifles at him, then killed them all in half a minute, became legend. Some versions said it was 10 Germans. Some said he did it with a pistol. Some said he was wounded and kept fighting. The details shifted and changed the way all war stories do. But the core truth remained. James Hendrix had stood at the edge of death, recognized the moment for what it was, and acted with such speed and precision that he turned certain capture or execution into a one-sided slaughter. The question that haunted some of the men who heard the story was simple. How? How does a man laugh when 7 rifles are pointed at his chest? How does he move that fast, shoot that accurately, stay that calm? The answer lay in a combination of factors that few soldiers possessed all at once. First, there was skill. Hendrix had grown up shooting. He knew his rifle the way a musician knows their instrument. The M1 Garand was an extension of his arms, his eyes, his will. He didn't have to think about mechanics or aim or trigger pull. It was all muscle memory, burned into him by thousands of hours of practice. Second, there was experience. By November 1944, Hendrix had been in combat for over a year. He had seen men freeze, seen them panic, seen them die because they hesitated. He had learned the hard lesson that survival belongs to those who act first and think later. His nervous system had been rewired by repeated exposure to violence. Where other men felt fear, Hendrix felt cold clarity. Third, there was calculation. In that frozen moment before the shooting started, Hendrix had assessed the situation with brutal logic. If he surrendered, he was at their mercy, and mercy was in short supply in late 1944. If he fought, he might die, but he'd take some of them with him. And there was a third option, the one he chose: act so quickly, so decisively, that the enemy never get a chance to pull their triggers. Fourth, there was psychology. That laugh wasn't bravado or insanity. It was a weapon. It created doubt in the enemy, made them hesitate, made them question what was happening. In a gunfight measured in seconds, doubt is death. And finally, there was something darker, something that Hendrix himself might not have been able to articulate. After months of watching friends die, after months of exhaustion and fear and anger, something had calcified inside him. The normal human fear of death had been replaced by something colder, a kind of fatalistic acceptance that allowed him to move without hesitation. The men who fought alongside Hendrix in the weeks after Aubeville noticed a change in him. He had always been quiet, competent, reliable. Now he was something else, something harder. He volunteered for point position on patrols. He took the most dangerous assignments without complaint. When the company faced heavy resistance at another village 2 weeks later, it was Hendrix who led the assault, moving through enemy fire with the same cold precision he'd shown in that courtyard. Some of the men admired him. Some feared him. Some avoided him, sensing something in him that made them uncomfortable. Sergeant Morrow put it simply: Hendrix doesn't fight like he's trying to survive. He fights like he's already dead and just hasn't fallen down yet. It was an accurate assessment. Something in that courtyard, in those 35 seconds, had severed some final connection between James Hendrix and his own mortality. He had looked at death, laughed at it, and killed it. And once you've done that, once you've stared down 7 loaded rifles and walked away without a scratch, it's hard to feel fear the same way again. The official record was dry and factual. Private First Class James R. Hendrix, service number 38475-621, was credited with killing 7 enemy soldiers in close quarters combat on November 16, 1944, near Aubeville, France. He was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism and coolness under fire, but said nothing about the laugh, nothing about the 35 seconds, nothing about what it cost him. because there was a cost. There always is. Hendrix survived the war. He made it through France into Germany, all the way to the end in May 1945. He came home to Arkansas with his medals and his memories and the cold weight of everything he'd seen and done. He didn't talk about the war. Not to his family, not to his friends, not to anyone, when asked about his service. He'd give short, vague answers and change the subject. The story of the courtyard at Aubeville became something that other people told. Not him. He went back to farming, married a local girl in 1947, had 3 children, lived a quiet life in the same county where he'd grown up. To anyone who knew him after the war, he seemed like a normal man, reserved, hard-working, dependable. But those who knew him well, his wife especially, could see the shadows, the way he'd wake up at night, breathing hard, staring at the ceiling, the way he'd flinch at sudden noises, the way he'd sometimes go quiet for hours, staring at nothing, lost in memories he refused to share. The courtyard at Aubeville stayed with him, not the killing itself. He had killed other men before and after that day, but the moment, the laugh, the choice, the 35 seconds when it becomes something other than human, something mechanical and efficient and utterly without mercy. War asks men to do terrible things. It asks them to kill, to watch friends die, to endure fear and pain and exhaustion beyond normal human limits. But the worst thing war does is this. It shows men what they're capable of. It strips away the civilized veneer and reveals a cold, calculating killer that evolution designed to survive at any cost. James Hendrix had met that version of himself in a muddy courtyard in France. He had laughed in the face of death and pulled the trigger 19 times in 35 seconds. And for the rest of his life, he carried the knowledge of what he could become when pushed to the edge. The broader lesson here extends beyond one soldier in one courtyard. It touches on a fundamental truth about human nature and conflict. We like to think of combat as a matter of training, equipment, and tactics. We study battles and analyze strategies and learn about firepower and maneuver. All of that matters. But at the individual level, at the moment when rifles are pointed and triggers are about to be pulled, survival comes down to something more primal. It comes down to who can act without hesitation, who can shut off the part of their brain that screams for caution and self-preservation, who can become, for a few critical seconds, something more like a machine than a man. The Germans in that courtyard had every advantage. They had numbers. They had the drop on Hendrix and Kowalski. Their weapons were already aimed. By every rational calculation, they should have won that engagement. Hendrix should have surrendered or died, but they hesitated, and he didn't. That's the edge that separates the living from the dead in war. Not courage, exactly. Courage implies acting despite fear. Hendrix didn't act despite fear. He acted without it, at least in that moment. He had moved beyond fear into something colder and more efficient. The same dynamic plays out in police shootings, self-defense situations, and any violent encounter where seconds matter. The person who acts decisively, who commits fully to violence without hesitation, almost always wins, regardless of numbers or position or firepower. It's an uncomfortable truth. We want to believe that the good guys win because they're righteous, because they're skilled, because justice is on their side. Sometimes that's true, but more often, the winner is simply the one who pulled the trigger first and didn't stop pulling until the threat was gone. Hendrix understood this instinctively. He didn't need a manual or a philosophy or a motivational speech. He just knew, in that moment, what had to be done, and he did it. There's a reason this story has endured, why it was told and retold throughout the 3rd Infantry Division and beyond. It's not just because of the body count or the dramatic nature of the encounter. It's because it represents something elemental about human conflict. It's the story of a man who recognized the stakes, made a choice, and executed that choice with such speed and precision that he rewrote the expected outcome. It's a reminder that in the most desperate moments, survival belongs to those who can shut off everything else. Fear, doubt, hesitation, mercy, and become pure action. But it's also a reminder of the cost. Hendrix survived, but something in him died in that courtyard. The ability to laugh at death, to kill without hesitation, to become that efficient. It's not something you can turn on and off like a switch. Once you've been that person, You carry it with you. It shapes how you see the world, how you see yourself, how you sleep at night. The soldiers who came home from World War II rarely talked about moments like this. They buried them deep, tried to forget, tried to be the men they'd been before the war. But those moments don't forget. They stay with you, surfacing in dreams, in sudden memories, in the way you react to loud noises or shadows, or anything that triggers the survival mechanisms that once kept you alive. For every story of extraordinary heroism in war, there's an untold story of the psychological price. For every medal awarded, there's a lifetime of living with what you had to do to earn it. For every 35 seconds of perfect lethal efficiency, there are decades of remembering what you became in those seconds. This is what makes Hendrix's story so powerful and so tragic. He did exactly what he needed to do. He saved his own life and his comrade's life. He eliminated an enemy threat with remarkable skill. By any military standard, his actions were exemplary, but he also crossed a line that most humans never cross. He looked at death, laughed, and became death himself, if only for 35 seconds. And once you've done that, there's no going back to who you were before. The lesson here isn't that we should all aspire to be like Hendrix in that moment. The lesson is that war demands this from some people, and we should recognize both the extraordinary nature of what they do and the permanent cost of doing it. We should honor the skill and the courage and the split-second decision-making that keeps soldiers alive in impossible situations. But we should also acknowledge that asking human beings to become machines of violence, even temporarily, even for good reasons, leaves scars that never fully heal. James Hendrix died in 1989 at the age of 68. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service, his family, his work as a farmer. It didn't mention the courtyard at Aubeville. It didn't mention the Silver Star. It didn't mention the 35 seconds that defined him more than anything else in his life. But the story survives. It survives in military history books, in regimental records, in the memories of the families of the men who served with him. It survives because it represents something essential about human nature under extreme stress, both the remarkable things we're capable of and the price we pay for that capability. In the end, the image that stays with you from this story isn't the carnage or the body count. It's the laugh, that low, cold sound that rang out in a muddy courtyard in France. The sound of a man who had calculated the odds, recognized his moment, and committed fully to the only path that led to survival. It was a sound of fear transformed into action, of hesitation turned into certainty, of a farm boy from Arkansas becoming, for 35 seconds, the most dangerous thing on that battlefield. And it's a reminder that in the most desperate moments, the line between life and death often comes down to who can act when everyone else is still thinking, who can move when everyone else is frozen, who can laugh when everyone else would weep. James Hendrix laughed, and then he fought, and then he lived. But living, as he learned, is its own kind of battle, one that lasts much longer than 35 seconds, one that doesn't end when the rifles go silent and the smoke clears, one that continues every day for the rest of your life. That's the real story of what happened in that courtyard. Not just a killing, but the living that came after, the burden of being the man who could do what needed to be done, and then having to wake up every morning and remember exactly what that was. War creates these moments. History records them. We tell stories about them. But we rarely talk about what happens to the men who lived through them, how they carry those 35 seconds with them through 35 years, through quiet farms and peaceful mornings, and ordinary days that feel anything but ordinary when you've seen what humans can do to each other. James Hendrix saved lives that day. His own, Kowalski's, maybe others, by eliminating an enemy position quickly and decisively. He was a hero by any definition. But heroes pay in different currency than the rest of us. They pay with pieces of themselves, pieces they can never get back, pieces that stay in muddy courtyards in France long after their bodies come home. If you found this story powerful, subscribe for more true accounts of courage, sacrifice, and the real cost of war. Where are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let me know what stories you want to hear next.